Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel, and I've got something very cool for you guys today, and that's a hands-on gameplay review of The Crust, a supply chain and colony simulator. Now, the developers over at VM Studio were generous enough to provide me with a review copy of the game. Thanks guys. So I've spent lots of the late hours after work testing out the gameplay, and I'm excited to share it with you guys here on the channel. Now, if this isn't the first time you've heard about this game, maybe you've already had it on your wishlist for some time or even played the demo back in January. Now, there are some new updates and features for you to know about, such as a new cargo robot and revamped warehousing and conveyor systems. Now, the game is inspired by titles such as Factorio, Surviving Mars, Satisfactory and Frostpunk, so should you be familiar with one of these games, then this will most likely scratch that factory/colony building itch that you have. The early game phase is what you might expect. You have to set up your first couple of harvesters, make sure all buildings are getting power, progress your research and then start expanding. Luckily, the menu is very informative and it shows you all buildings available in the game, even before you have unlocked them through research, something that I found really helpful for planning in advance, knowing where you're working towards, or so that you can take into account certain research or building material requirements. As you can see here, the game gives out very clear tips in the form of a small show and tell, presented by the Crust's version of Don Draper, with a small video to actually give you a visual example, which I found really useful. You know how games sometimes have these advisor NPCs that will simply tell a somewhat high-level story instead of showing you? Now, in my opinion, these tips are very nicely done and thorough enough to not leave me guessing on how to do something afterwards. The game also does an excellent job of showing you where all the inputs and outputs of all buildings are, a necessity if your goal is to get really organized later on in the game, so you don't down spiral towards having a random spaghetti layout of conveyor belts going all over the place. Right from the start, you'll notice that these little drones you're starting out with are transporting all the resources, performing construction, and you'll have to assign some of them to mining duty as well. Since you only have a handful to start with, it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that you'll have to unburden them as soon as possible by setting up conveyor belts to automate processes. This demonstrates the game's ability to present you with certain organizational issues to be solved pretty early on, and this will only intensify the more you start upscaling your operation later on in the game, because then it becomes a puzzle on how to most effectively get your resources from A to B. Now, the conveyor belt system is really intuitive, it snaps into place pretty easily, and it has some decent pathfinding when you're shown a preview as you drag it from one building to another, but you'll want to control this manually if you want to have a specific layout for your production lines. Another game the Crust took inspiration from is Dyson Sphere program, which I loved playing, and I could be spending lots of time trying to make the numbers add up. You know, for example, this extractor produces 20 regoliths per minute, so how many smelters can I place after it to consume as close to that 20 and then produce X amount of titanium oxide in trying to set up a production chain as effective as possible. Now, in this game, it's pretty much the same, but numbers don't transfer one-on-one from one building to the next, so you'll be stuck with overflow in some form pretty quickly. Refineries also produce slag as a waste product, which becomes a real pain in the behind very quickly, since there's no real way to get rid of it other than being needed for production of food, but that's more towards mid-game. I felt it was missing some sort of a way to scrap it, because you'll quickly end up with several storages filled with nothing but slag. When it comes to storing things, it's unavoidable that sooner rather than later you'll have to think about how to properly store all your resources, and because some are just half fabricates for more complex items, you'll have to plan ahead on how to have them connect to another production line without having to delete and rebuild certain buildings and conveyors. Part of this tinkering process in these type of games is always a large part of the fun for me, and on that front the game really delivers, because there's so much to do in terms of planning and designing your colony. Setting up your power grid in terms of placing buildings is easy, but I found that understanding the actual numbers at the top of the screen was a bit more difficult, with the tooltips causing some confusion as to what they were telling me. Now, I got thrown off track with the word shortage. I feel if it would have said difference, then it would make more sense. Now, eventually it all comes down to making sure you have enough power stored in your batteries to last a long lunar night, otherwise your buildings will start shutting down. I've had this problem in the beginning quite a few times, and then it's really just about putting the game in fast mode and waiting until dawn, at which point your solar panels will start generating power again, and that's quite tedious. So that's something to keep an eye out for. One of the things I find very attractive with this game is that it has these multiple layers of letting you utilize your produced goods. Aside from constructing new buildings, you can send out rovers to investigate certain mission sites on the moon, and they'll result in an objective to complete, which is usually transporting some resources to that site, and you'll get a reward. Resources can of course also be used for trading on the general market or be used in fulfilling contracts. The Crust has a feature called contracts, which comes pretty close to the concept of selling your goods on the market in exchange for funds. But contracts will occasionally also reward you with research income, which is needed to research new technologies. Contracts will also reward you an amount of reputation, and the better your reputation, the more contracts you can choose from. They cycle pretty frequently, and because of the varying rewards, you can easily spend a couple of minutes looking around for good deals. I will say that at times the contracts seem quite unfair or unachievable, especially when you're just starting out and you're producing maybe like 5 steel bars per minute, and then there's this contract already asking for 500, 5,000 maybe even units to be delivered. But the best part about contracts is that they enable you to acquire extra research points early on, which will help speed up research, which in turn will streamline and accelerate your production. Now, going over to research, the game has 3 types of research: fundamental, engineering and social. Each type has its own amount of income, which can be generated in several ways. The way this is done is somewhat different than the usual approach in games, and it forces you to actively and constantly look for ways to acquire income points. Not in such a way where it's annoying, but it does require some separate attention from time to time. For example, you might gain 100 points of social research for the next 90 days, after which you'll lose 100 points. Now, this time window is long enough for you not to worry about these income flows every 5 minutes, which is nice, otherwise it would be too distracting. The only thing I feel is missing when looking at the research screen is twofold. One is actually being able to see all the research options in terms of content, and secondly is a scroll bar at the side. Now, you have to use your scroll wheel to move up and down at quite a slow pace, which seems unnecessary. It's early access and this isn't game breaking, but I'm hoping this gets added somewhere along the way. Now, watching this video, and especially if you're the kind of gamer that predominantly plays these type of games, you have a pretty good idea of the gameplay loop at this point. But it's not just about building production lines, and this is where I feel it's almost like a game within a game. You can build and manage an entire group of colonists. This feels very much like surviving Mars, but the Crust has added more details to individual colonists. It's not like The Sims or anything, but they all have their own profile with skills and traits that you can play around with during a duty roster and everything. I'd like to believe I've spent quite some time playing the game, and it took me a while, maybe on the 3rd evening, before I felt comfortable to look at the colonist part. You need a good, reliable production of certain resources to start constructing rooms, but you also need to have several key modules researched to be able to make the place habitable. I feel like I've only been able to scratch the surface of the colony part of the game, and I will explore it in more depth and give you guys some updates about it later on, but from what I've experienced so far, it's really interesting. Now, after I set my mind to getting colonists established, so I got invested into the concept of creating a habitable area, thinking about the layout, different rooms, decorating, it made me forget about the entire industry part, so it almost feels like having 2 games in one, the industry part and the colony simulator. I can't and don't want to tell you much about the narrative storyline because I feel that's something you should explore and experience yourself, and you don't need me to spoil any surprises for you, but just as a small footnote, storytelling is also nicely incorporated into the natural progression in the game. Something that I find really cool because it makes me more invested into what I'm doing, and it adds some flavor to figuring out how the game works. Looking at the game's visual presentation, I already mentioned the UI, but the building models and animations don't disappoint either. You can zoom all the way in to look at the models and see how they operate, which is done really well. Light sources from buildings and drones create just the right atmosphere for what you'd expect from a lunar base setting based on other games and movies. The music in the background is just perfect for this game as well. A quiet piano track or low-key EDM that's not too present and matches perfectly with the vibe of the gameplay. Some tracks have vocals in them, but nothing too outrageous or distracting. In the previous video I made about the Crust, I criticized part of the voice acting, but as I was going over the tutorial again, I realized that it was probably me being picky on a personal level, because in the time between that demo and this early access release right now, some parts that weren't voice scripted before have been given full audio lines this time around, so I'd like to think it's still work in progress. Now, as you get to spend some time playing the Crust, it's clear that you really have to enjoy working on these layouts and keep improving them, because routing and rerouting conveyor belts and upgrading storages is inevitable as you research better versions. Sometimes this requires you to tear down certain parts of your production lines or upgrade them to create a better workflow, and this can be quite time and resource consuming and might feel like a distraction from actually progressing in the game. Maybe this will be more addressed by the campaign, but from the sandbox mode perspective, I really wonder what the late game content will bring. What do I do when I have unlocked all buildings and have all my production set up in an organized way? And this isn't to say that the game is lacking, because I haven't been able to dig deep enough in these few days to really judge or say anything insightful about late game content. But on top of that, I don't know how the game plays when you have 400 instead of 4 colonists. I think the Crust is a great game in its genre. Now, I enjoy spending 30 minutes puzzling on how to expand and reroute certain production processes, and I can appreciate the way the game looks whilst doing so. Now, the one core game pillar that I do feel is falling short so far is in not having a real sense of urgency in working towards our very species' survival. The background stories on the contract missions kinda hint at some emergency in general, but it's not really actively demonstrated through gameplay itself. I haven't encountered any bugs so far, so in terms of an early access release, I think that the devs did a really good job of presenting a very playable product. Now, digging through the press kit, the roadmap and the Discord channel, you can really tell that they have a well-organized project running, which ironically perfectly ties into the type of game that they're creating. Since prices aren't made public yet, there isn't much to discuss here about prices, but taking a very rough range, I think the game will land somewhere between $30 to $40, $45 or euros, which I feel is a solid price at this point. However, I do understand a lot of you watching might not be too enthusiastic about paying these prices for early access games and like to just watch some more reviews, so that's why I encourage you to subscribe to the channel if you aren't already, because I will follow up on the Crust here to make sure you can make up your mind based on some more in-depth gameplay. Now, I've done a whole lot of talking and I'd like to hear from you how you've experienced this The Crust initial gameplay, and maybe share with me what you'd like to see more of, then I'll do my best to accommodate you guys. That's all for this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching it. If you like it, click like to support the video, and don't forget, as always, have fun gaming, be nice to one another, and take care guys.